Well, I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's a great holiday, isn't it? It's actually, they call it the busiest travel holiday of the year. Did you know that? And I don't know about you, if you've ever traveled on Thanksgiving, you know how crazy it can be, right? When you're trying to travel and trying to get home, back to your hometown or back with family and things like that. In fact, it's so crazy on Thanksgiving, they even made a movie about traveling on Thanksgiving. If you remember, it was back in the 80s. I remember I was in college and I came home for Thanksgiving and we went and saw this movie. It was called Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. You remember that movie? For those of you that didn't see it or forgot about it, I'll give you a short little recap about this movie because it was funny, but it was also kind of disturbing in some ways. And it starred John Candy and Steve Martin. Steve Martin's character, he was a businessman. He was in New York on a business trip, and he's trying to get out of his meetings so that he can go home to Chicago in time for Thanksgiving to spend with his family. And what should have been this easy, short flight turns into a disaster, right? And just nothing goes his way. Everything goes wrong. And during the course of the movie, you see Steve Martin, his frustration just keeps growing and growing, right? And he starts losing hope and just getting more and more frustrated as, first of all, his plane is rerouted and they have to land somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and then he can't get another flight, so then they get on a train, right? And they try to and the train breaks down. Then they go from the train, somehow they find a car that he can run, and that ends up catching on fire. And all the while, all these things are going wrong, he also has this unwanted traveling companion in his polar opposite, who's John Candy, that he's dealing with, right? So the movie's kind of funny on him trying to get home, but one of the reasons why the movie's so good, I think, is because we can all identify with this, can't we? That when things don't go like we think they should go, it's frustrating, isn't it? And, we've all traveled and things kind of go wrong. And have you ever been there, though, that things just aren't going right and you just get more and more frustrated? It seems like the more frustrated you get, the more things go wrong, and then the more frustrated you get. And as that kind of grows, it doesn't just... This kind of frustration doesn't just exist, though, in like travel stress. It's the rest of life, isn't it? Even our spiritual lives, we can experience this kind of frustration, even when we go out and we want to follow God and things don't go as we expect they should go, or things don't go as easy as we think they should be. It can get frustrating, can't it? And this is kind of what we can encounter and what we learn from our passage this morning in Exodus chapter 5. So as we return to our journey through Exodus, why don't you turn to Exodus chapter 5. We're going to go through the whole chapter this morning and look at what's happening here in this story of God's deliverance of his people, God bringing his people back to himself, right? Who were once enslaved in Egypt. And so far in the story of Exodus, we're only in chapter 5, but so far what we've had most recently is you have this guy Moses, right, who's God's chosen deliverer for bringing God's people out of Egypt. And he's in the land of Midian for 40 years, and so he wasn't doing what God had wanted him to do or had planned for him to do, but yet God visits him, right, in this burning bush, and he calls Moses back to Egypt. And at first, Moses doesn't want to go, and he gives all these excuses, you remember, and God kind of reassures him. He says, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to make it possible for this to happen, and this is what's going to happen. He even gives him his brother as a helper. Aaron comes and helps him. So now we kind of we looked at last week, that now when Aaron comes, Moses then starts to embark on this journey back to Egypt. And he takes some of these critical first steps in following God that are necessary, that we need when we're going out to engage our world. And at this point, Aaron and Moses now, they're walking with confidence, right? Which is this last critical step. First step as they go. And they're walking with confidence back to Egypt because they have to go and talk to the elders of Israel, or the Hebrew people, and convince them what God told them about delivering them from the Egyptians. So they go and they meet and they show all the signs and wonders that God had given them, and they meet with them and they believe them, just as God has promised. These elders believe Moses and Aaron and say, all right, God will deliver us. Great. And at this point, Moses and Aaron, they're flying high. They're like, man, everything's going great, isn't it? This is so cool. And they're just raring to go. And they're like, great, now we're ready to launch out into our world. Launch out into going and confronting Pharaoh now. We're going to say, all right, free us, and he's going to free us, and it's going to be great. Because this is what God wants. Well, it doesn't exactly happen precisely like that, does it? In fact, what we kind of read was that things kind of go not necessarily according to plan. And it doesn't go as smoothly as they thought or they expected it would go. And what happens is frustration begins to grow, not only with Moses, but also with God's people. And sometimes when we follow God out into our world, it can be like this. Maybe it's, we follow God's call to be a witness at school or at work, and to share Jesus with our friends. Or maybe it's to take a stand, an important stand for God's truth. Or maybe it's just to serve him and serve others. And we step out and we follow God, and we think that since we're following God, man, we're blessed and everything's going to go awesome. Have you ever done that? Now, have you ever experienced where it doesn't necessarily go as awesome, or as this rosy picture that we kind of make in our own mind of what it means to follow God, and it's going to be this glorious victory, and it doesn't always go that way, does it? And when it doesn't go that way, sometimes we can get frustrated, can't we? Frustration starts to build. Sometimes it's in our call. Sometimes we're sitting there going, well, maybe God didn't really call me to do this. Maybe I'm not up to the task. Maybe I'm not the person who should be doing it. Sometimes our frustration grows in our circumstances. We're just like, what's wrong with people? Why won't they listen to me? Why isn't this going right? I'm doing everything right, and yet it's not responding. Sometimes we even get frustrated with God, and we say, God, where are you in this? Why is this? I'm doing everything right, and you're not holding up your end of the bargain here. Have you ever felt like that? Well, if you've ever experienced that, or if that's a fear of yours and what could happen when you follow God, then I want to look a little closer at our passage, because what we find through this kind of growing frustration in Moses and Aaron and some of God's people as they enter the real world in following God and some of the twists and turns, what this passage does is it not only chronicles that, but it teaches us how we can manage our frustrations. It teaches us some important truths about managing our frustrations when things don't necessarily go how we think they should go in following God. So we're going to kind of look at that. So here's how Moses' interaction with Pharaoh kind of begins. And we kind of read this already, but I just want to expound on a couple things right at the very start so we can get this picture of them following. Remember, they're all set to follow God, man. They're all like, we're ready to go. And hopefully you can get some of the excitement. It says in the first verse, it says, so after they go and talk to these elders, and they listen to them, so this was a great victory, they went and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Isn't it cool? They're speaking for God. They're like, thus says the Lord. That's important. If you can say that, thus says God, you have great authority. And then they say, let my people go. Every time I read that, I look at Charlton Heston. You ever watch Ten Commandments? When he goes, let my people go. Mr. Overactor himself, right? And you're sitting there and it's very dramatic. So picture this. So it's this great moment where they come before Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Because we want to hold a feast, right? God wants us to hold a feast to him in the wilderness. And what they're talking about is it's like this religious worship celebration to God. And oftentimes what would happen when you had a religious observance to your God, you would go somewhere else to do it, be it a temple or something like that. Since the Israelites didn't have a temple, this time they said, we want to go off by ourselves in the wilderness and do this for a few days and be able to have this. So they have this great thing, right? Well, seems reasonable, doesn't it? Well, check out Pharaoh's response in verse 2. He says this. He says, well, who's the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? Who's this God that you speak of that I should obey him? So think about this. Egypt is the most powerful empire, nation in the world at this time. And Pharaoh is the king of this. And the Pharaoh in Egypt was looked at as a godlike figure. So he's like, wait a minute, I'm the most powerful leader, I'm godlike, of the most powerful nation on earth. Who's this who's going to tell me I need to obey him? Compared to me, who is this? Then he says, I don't know the Lord. So I don't know God, this God you speak of. And besides that, he says, or moreover, I will not let Israel go. So he's got this total disdain for this God that Moses and Aaron are speaking about, and lack of respect for this God, right? And he's just kind of just putting them down. He says, no, there's no reason I should do this. So Moses and Aaron then, they take it a step further, right? He presses the issue. And here's what he says in verse 3. And they said, well, the God of the Hebrews, he's met with us. He's come and talked to us. And so please let us go. So now they're not speaking for God. Now they're kind of bargaining here with Pharaoh. And they're like, listen, just let us go for 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we can sacrifice to the Lord our God. Because you know what? This Lord our God, he demands our obedience. And if we don't do that, we could get punished. Look what they say next. Lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. So if we don't do this, he might kill us. So what Moses and Aaron are saying, this is really important to us. You know, don't just dismiss this. It's important to us. But he's also kind of, it's kind of a veiled threat he's giving to Pharaoh here, because he's saying, you know, if our God can kill us, he could probably take you out too. So you should take this seriously. You should take this request to heart. Guess what? Pharaoh doesn't. In fact, look at verse 4. What he does here is he actually blames Moses for this whole issue. He says, look at this. He says to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from the work? Get back to your burdens. He's like, what are you guys doing? You're distracting these people. Don't you realize these people are important? He goes, you know, behold, the people of the land are many, and you make them rest from their burdens? So now he's blaming Moses and Aaron, and he's calling them out and saying, you're messing things up here. These people, they're critical for our infrastructure, building all these buildings and things like we're doing, and you're taking them away from that. This is your fault. Talk about things not going well, right? So they're kind of reeling here. Imagine Moses and Aaron sitting here going, wait a minute, what did we do? We just did what God wanted us to do. God told us to do this, and he said he was going to deliver the people, and now this happens. Can you relate to that? You kind of go out and you're just like, what happened, right? It was far from the warm welcome that Moses may have expected or desired, and it was a bit of a shock to them. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it feels like this with me. Sometimes when you kind of go out and I share Jesus with a friend of mine or something, and they reject God. They're like, that's a fairy tale. Come on, don't give me that garbage. This stuff, deal in the real world. I don't deal with that stuff. That's for the weak. Anybody ever said something like that to you before? And you're just like, wait a minute. I mean, because we know our message, right? The message of Jesus has changed our lives, right? It's made us brand new, and we're like, this is the greatest message ever, and it could change your life. Why aren't you getting this? Do you ever kind of have that feeling, and you're just like, why are they being so negative towards this? This is something positive. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help you. Yet what we learn from Pharaoh's response to this reasonable request from Moses and Aaron, right? It helps us in these kinds of frustrations that we can have in following God when our message isn't received. Because, you see, in dealing with our frustrations and following God, you know what we need to realize? We need to realize, first of all, that our world doesn't always recognize God. And this should help us in our frustrations that we may have when we go out and the message of God that we're bringing to people is rejected. When we remember, well, yeah, our world isn't going to always recognize God. In fact, they might not always love and support God like we do. And they might not love and support his followers or act nice towards his followers for that matter. I mean, look at this. Pharaoh showed no regard, did he, for God? Who is this God? And he showed even less regard for his followers. Sitting there going, well, this is your guys' fault. Don't get away from your work. You know, you guys have too much time on your hands. So basically, he tries to punish God's followers even more, doesn't he? In fact, we read, Debbie read that. She kind of went on in verse 6 on some of the things that Pharaoh did next, right? Look what Pharaoh did next to the people. Talk about taking something out on the people that seemed totally out of left field and unwarranted. He says, you know what? He brings in the Egyptian taskmasters, who are kind of like the guards over the slaves, right? And then he brings in the Hebrew foremen. Okay, so these are Hebrews that were enlisted by the Egyptians to make sure that the Hebrew slaves were getting their work done. And he brings both of these groups in. He says, listen, change of plans in your work. You know that straw that's so necessary for making, it's a binding agent for the bricks that you're making. Well, we as Egypt, we're not going to supply this straw anymore. You're responsible for going and getting it yourself. So now the Israelites, they have to now go, in addition to making their bricks, they have to go and find straw to use for the bricks. And it says they scattered throughout the land to go find the straw for the bricks. And to make matters worse, or if things weren't bad enough, Pharaoh then implies, you know what, these Hebrews, they're idle, right? He says, they're idle, or basically, they're lazy. They have too much time on their hands. You see, they're sitting around. If they have enough time to think about worshiping their God, then they have too much time. We need to keep them busier. We must not be doing enough. We must not be giving them enough hardship. So let's make it really hard. Not only take away the straw from them, but let's keep the quota on how many bricks they need to produce every day. Let's keep that the same. So not only are they having to take time out of their work that's taking them all day to do, to go get straw, they still have to produce just as many bricks. So this makes a difficult task nearly impossible. Talk about oppression. This is just mean, isn't it? Can you relate to this, though? Can you relate to what happens here? Sometimes when we're out in our world and, we're living out our faith, we're not really causing trouble. We're not really threatening anybody. In fact, we have the best intentions. Yet we face opposition that seems really over the top. Like hatred for things that we're like, where did that come from? Sometimes it's at work. Maybe, we get singled out or we get warned. You better stop that or you'll be fired. And you're just like, well, wait a minute, what I do? Or maybe we're targeted by other people and we're made fun of at school or something, or we're hated even though we didn't do anything to deserve it or to deserve that kind of reaction. We see it all the time in our world, don't we? This over-the-top reaction just because we follow God. And we're just like, where did that come from? It seems hardly fair. Doesn't seem right? But it happens, doesn't it? And it can be very frustrating. And you're sitting here, what did we do wrong? Well, Jesus spoke about this kind of thing. He says we should expect this kind of thing. In fact, in John's gospel, he says this. He says, he's talking to his followers. He says, if you were of the world would love you as its own. Or if you were out there living like the world lived, the world wouldn't have a problem with you. But because you're not of the world, but I chose you out of the world. Okay? So because you don't live like the world, you obey me and follow me, therefore the world hates you. Did you know that? This is a promise that God gives. And that Jesus tells his followers that when we go out and we follow God, the world won't always recognize God, and the world won't always like God or like us. And it may not seem fair, but that's the way it is. Well, why would anybody hate us like that, right? Because we're going out and we're caring for them. Look at some of the work we do as followers of Jesus, and we want to feed the poor and take care of the homeless and take care of widows and make sure kids get to have great holidays and things like that. And we're just like, man, we want to care for people, right? And we want people to experience salvation. We have their best at heart. So it doesn't seem fair that this is happening. But Jesus explains what the source of this hatred of the world towards him and us is all about. And this helps us deal with our frustration in that sense. Here's what he says earlier in John's gospel. He says this, and this is the judgment. The light of the world has come into the world, and the people love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. Now remember, Jesus has declared himself the light of the world. In fact, Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount says we're the light of the world, right? A city up on a hill can't be hidden. So we're this light. And what does it say? Well, the world who's in darkness or who's in sin hates the light. Why? Well, Jesus, as the light of the world, makes those who are in darkness feel uncomfortable. You know why? Because he exposes sin. You see, when we follow Jesus and we're walking in grace and we're walking in forgiveness and we're walking in life, that makes people that are walking in darkness have to deal with their own darkness. It's kind of like in your room, you know, as you're growing up and you have to clean your room. And you're just like, man, I don't want to clean my room. It looks fine because we always keep the lights real dim. But if somebody comes in and turns on the light, it's like, I got to clean it now. So what do? We always keep our room dim, don't we? So that we don't see so much dirt. And that's kind of what it's talking about. We want to keep it in darkness. So our world around us, they don't want light around them because light makes them deal with their darkness. So they want to reject that. And that's what's kind of behind it. It's the curse of sin, right? Sin wants to hide in the shadows so that it can't be seen as it truly is. Death, right? So this is why when we follow God out at our work or school or with friends, that our message and what we do for God is often rejected. And it can be frustrating. But it doesn't have to be frustrating for us. Do you know why? Because when that happens for us, instead of getting frustrated, you know what we can be? We can be encouraged to say, you know what? If the world is hating me because of this, then I must be doing something right. See, sometimes when we're getting persecuted or we're getting oppressed because we're following God, it should encourage us to say, wow, I'm following God. So I must be doing something right, and God is with me. So that should encourage us. So that's our first way, our first truth that we learn here in the passage. Now back to Egypt. So Pharaoh's rejection of God and this message, it leads him to oppress God's people even more, right? And as he oppresses, the suffering of God's people increases, doesn't it? In fact, as this decree went out, right, the Hebrews, they go to find their straw, and they're trying to keep up, but guess what? They're not keeping up. In fact, later on here in the passage, it says that the taskmasters notice that the Hebrews aren't keeping up with their brick production. So they call in all the foremen, and they tell the foreman, you're not keeping up. You have to keep up. And they start to beat them because they're not keeping up. And they're just saying, you guys are failing, and we're just going to make life harder for you. And verse 15, here's what happens. How these foremen respond. Then the foremen of the people of Israel came, and they cried to Pharaoh. So they go to Pharaoh, and they said, you know what? This is too much. We're taking this to the top. And they go to Pharaoh and they say, why do you treat your servants like this? No straw is given to your servants. Yet they say, your taskmasters say to us, make bricks, and behold, your servants are beaten. But the fault is in your own people. This isn't us who did this. This is you that did this. This isn't our fault. We're trying our best. Right? This isn't fair. You ever come to that realization where you're just like, man, I'm frustrated because this doesn't seem fair. I'm following God, and I'm watching people that aren't following God, and they're prospering, and I'm sitting here struggling and suffering. That's not fair. And it can start, so God's people, they start suffering more, and they cry out for some relief, right? And the most frustrating part of this, it's not their fault that they're suffering so much. They're still working hard, yet they're being blamed for something that the Egyptians were doing rather than their own failure. This brings us to another truth in helping to deal with this kind of frustration when things don't seem fair and we're suffering and we're just like, why are we suffering? This isn't right. And it can help us deal with some of these frustrations that can arise when following God, especially when facing opposition and trials that come to us. See, we need to realize not only that our world doesn't always recognize God, but also that suffering that comes to us, it's not always punishment. You see, sometimes we look at suffering, right? And when bad things start to happen to us, right? And we're following God, we're being faithful, we're living for Him in our world, and we start to encounter this opposition, and we start to encounter hardship. And we're like, this stinks. We shouldn't like suffering. We shouldn't like to suffer. But yet, suffering shouldn't frustrate us to this point. You see, sometimes we start to suffer. Things don't seem to be going so smoothly. As a matter of fact, we start following God, and stuff's happening to us. It seems out of left field. Now, sometimes it can be a spiritual attack, or sometimes it can be something else happening to us. But stuff starts going wrong, right? Maybe it's an unexpected house repair that comes out that we don't have the money for, so then we can't pay some of our other bills. Maybe it's a health issue that comes and just stops us dead in our tracks. Or maybe it's our car breaks down, or a friend we had for a long time all of a sudden starts hating us and doesn't talk to us anymore, and that relationship is broken, right? When things like this happen, what's often our first reaction to this, our first response, our first questions to this? What'd I do wrong? Right? What'd I do? Wait a minute. What did I do to deserve this? Have you ever said that? You ever shouted out and just say, I'm doing everything. I'm being faithful. What am I still doing wrong? You know why that is? Because we equate suffering with punishment. So we say, if bad things happen, we must be doing something bad to deserve it. If good things happen, we must be doing something good to deserve it. And that's not always the case. See, when things don't go smoothly, we think we did something wrong. So if we can just be perfect, then things are going to go correct. Right? Well, sometimes we do face struggles and trials and suffering because they're consequences of something we did wrong, but sometimes it's not the case. There's times when we suffer when we didn't do anything wrong. And that can be incredibly frustrating. Right? And it's the kind of thing that the Hebrew foremen are crying out to Pharaoh about, you know? And they're like, we didn't do anything wrong. This isn't fair. And Pharaoh tells them, says, I don't care. I don't care that it's not fair. Just do what I tell you to do. So now they feel like they're completely out of control. And that often is what happens to us, right? When we have to go through suffering and trials that are out of our control. It becomes incredibly frustrating. It's kind of like with some of the COVID and some of the lockdowns, and it's nothing we can control, and it just keeps happening to us. And what happens? We get more and more frustrated, right? And we get more and more angry because we're not in control of something. So what do we tend to do? We tend to lash out. We tend to blame somebody. We got to have somebody to blame, right? And we got to feel like we're getting control back. So here's what the foremen do. They blame Moses. In fact, after they leave Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron are waiting right outside. And it says in verse 21, they said to Aaron and Moses, they said, the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Basically, this is all your fault. We're suffering. It's not our fault. You should have never said anything. Because you opened your big mouth, now Pharaoh did all that to us. And it's not fair and it's not right. Have you ever felt like that? And you're just like, this isn't cool, you know? But yet this suffering, it had nothing to do with what Moses said to Pharaoh, did it? He didn't do anything wrong. He was obeying what God wanted. In fact, Moses and the people were being obedient and they were being faithful. No, this oppression and suffering were outside of their control. It was brought on by a sinful world that they lived in. It was brought on by Pharaoh, right? But know this promise. No matter what suffering we go through, God promises to be with us in this suffering. In fact, God was with his people through this suffering. The prophet Isaiah says this, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. Do you know why that is? Because God is in control. He's bigger than anything we can possibly face. We looked at that a couple weeks ago, right? God is bigger than anything we can possibly face, and it's all in his control. He is the great I am, who was and is to come. He's over it all. So God is bigger than whatever suffering we're going with, and he's with us. But I don't know about you. I sit there and say, well, if God's bigger than this, then why doesn't he stop it? Because if God's bigger than this, if I'm still going through this suffering, he must be allowing it. And that brings on an interesting realization to us. That suffering isn't always punishment. Actually, sometimes God works in and through us in our suffering. You see, God can work in us going through trials to grow us, to shape us to look more like Him, to increase our trust in Him. And other times, God can take us through suffering and unfair, difficult things to make us a testimony to the world around us. That we go through things just like our neighbors go through, but we go through them differently, trusting in God. So we become a testimony of, yeah, we're going through difficult things, but we have hope. It doesn't break us. It doesn't make us fall apart. Isn't that interesting? You know, I had a friend of mine, he's a Jewish friend of mine that I've been witnessing to for a couple years now. And it was interesting. We met a couple weeks ago, right, when Debbie went in the hospital. And I told him, man, I can't come to this banquet I was supposed to go to with him. And I said, I can't go. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. My dad was in the hospital at the time. And he looks at me and goes, I have a question for you. He goes, how do people go through such troubles and so many bad things and still be positive? And I said, you mean like me? And he goes, yeah, like you. He said, well, because I have my faith in God. Because I trust that He's in control. And he goes, well, what does that mean? And then I got to take 20 minutes with him and share with him the gospel. A testimony. You see, because how I was going through suffering became a testimony. And that is what God is doing with the Israelite nation. Because, do you remember His promise that He gave to Moses? What would happen when they were released from Egypt? Exodus chapter 3. Remember, He's saying that they're going to release you. You're going to be delivered. And this is what's going to happen. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. When you go, you shall not go empty. And then it talks about they're going to give you their jewels and their riches. And they're going to send you off with all of these great things. And we talked a little bit about that, right? That the heart of the Egyptian people is going to be turned towards the Israelites and their God. And they're going to say, man, these people went through this. And with faith, maybe their God is something. And that's a promise that God gave. And God is taking the Israelite people through this unfair treatment. Soon the Egyptians are going to wake up to this and say, that's not fair what's happening to them. But yet, they keep plugging along. They keep their faith in God. They've been consistent with this. Maybe there's something to this. So God's using this suffering as a testimony. So when we suffer unjustly in following God into our world, rather than being frustrated that we're going through this suffering, be encouraged, because God can use our suffering to not only grow us, but also to reach our world better. So, grasp hold of that. And then finally, so the foremen, they kind of confront Moses, right, and Aaron, and they blame them, and they lash out at them, right? Well, Moses and Aaron, when they hear this, they're equally frustrated. They're like, wait a minute. What are you blaming us for? I mean, go through their thinking here. I mean, they're sitting there. God promised that He was going to work, right? He promised that the people would follow us. And here they are now blaming us. They're not following us anymore. They're blaming us for all their problems. Yet it's through what Moses and Aaron do next that teaches us something very important about dealing with our frustrations when we're following with God out into our world. And that's when we realize that we can always go to God. In fact, rather than Moses and Aaron just sitting there and complaining about what happened to them, you know what they do? They go to God. They go to God honestly, and God draws near to them. Now, Moses and Aaron, and I want to make a note of this, and we're going to read this in our passage. When they go to God with their frustration, they're not going to God with any kind of great trust. It's not this heroic spiritual high, this act of worship or anything like this, right? They're not going in great reverence like when God demanded that when Moses, take off your shoes, the ground you're standing on is holy ground, this is all holy. Moses isn't seeing God like this right now. No, when Moses and Aaron come to God now, it's raw and it's honest. Okay? It doesn't really look very churchy. Look at what they say. Verse 22, it says, Then Moses turned to the Lord and he says, "Oh Lord, why have you done this evil to your people? Why did you even send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he's done evil to this people, and you haven't delivered your people at all." So imagine this. Have you ever felt frustrated with God and you're just like, what are you doing, God? And you're sitting there going, oh, I can't go to God like that. Guess what? God's big enough for us to come to him. You know, I read this and you're just like, man, the lightning's going to come out of heaven and it's going to strike Moses dead. How could somebody go and speak to God like this? But do you know what? God wants us to come to him. Even when we're frustrated, even when we don't understand, even when we have doubts, even when we're angry, he wants us to come to him. Because you know why? He already knows how we feel. Do you know that? We can't hide that from him. But when we come to him, what we do is we realize, first of all, he doesn't strike us dead, but he's there with us. And now he can work on this in us. Because now we're ready to admit it finally, that this is how we feel, so that he can then reveal his presence to us. And this is what Moses and Aaron do, is they're brutally honest with God, but they find a God who really does care. God can handle our frustrations, our doubts, our fears, even our anger. He desires that we come with all of it. In fact, Peter talks about this. He says, casting all of our anxieties on him, all of our troubles, all of our stress, all of our frustration, because he cares for us. You see, God already knows. So when we come honestly with our burdens, we get it out so it can be dealt with. Because that's what God wants us to do when we go to him. In fact, the psalmist says this: when the righteous cry out for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. Now, this doesn't mean he might not stop our suffering right away. But what he's going to do is he's going to give us our perspective so that those troubles don't have to consume us anymore. So he delivers us from all of our struggles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions or sufferings of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. Isn't that amazing? This is our God. This is why we can come to God, because the only way we're going to find any relief from our suffering, any perspective when it comes to our suffering so that it doesn't overwhelm us, is by going to God. Even when we might not necessarily like God that much. We might not be all that pleased with God. We might not be all that trusting in God. All the more we should be going to God and saying, God, I don't trust you anymore. In fact, I don't agree with what you're doing. Isn't that what Moses and Aaron do? They said, you sent us here, and nothing went like you said. In fact, you haven't delivered us at all. We're doing all the work, and we haven't seen you work at all. That's basically what they're saying. Do you ever feel like that with God? Well, here, Aaron and Moses, they come to God, and they tell him that. And you know the amazing thing that happens after they tell God that? Is God doesn't say, how dare you speak to me like that, you worm? You're done. I'm taking everything away from you. No, you know what God says? Just hold on. Watch me work. Be patient. Go to chapter 6, verse 1. So the next chapter kind of opens like this. It says, but the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. So he says, all right, now you're in a position, watch me. He says, for with a strong hand, my strong hand, he will send them out. And with a strong hand, my strong hand, right, he will drive them out of this land. So not only is Pharaoh going to let you go, he's going to send you out. He's going to push you out. All of this anger he has because you asked to leave, he's going to say, please just get out. Talk about a turnaround. And God says, so come to me with that, because I'm going to tell you, I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to remind you that I'm in control and I'm working. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. It's going to turn. See, God is still in control. He's still working. He says, just be patient, keep trusting. Everything might not be going according to your plan, Moses, but it's going exactly according to mine. Isn't that cool? You know, when we come to God honestly with our frustration, you know what we discover? We discover a God who's always faithful. We discover a God who can shoulder our burdens, who's not going to hate us through it, but that actually cares. And then he's going to reveal his presence to us. He's going to remind us of his presence for us. And that's a promise that we have, that we can always go to God. So, like these Hebrews, like the Israelite people, and Moses in Egypt, we see this week that following a faithful God isn't always easy, is it? And I'm sure you experienced that. And if you haven't experienced it, you will experience it. That it's not always easy, and it's not always stress-free or trouble-free. You know, sometimes our friends or our coworkers or our families, they're going to reject us, and they're going to reject our message. However, don't lose heart. Because our world doesn't always recognize God. But keep sharing. You know, sometimes we're going to go through trials. Sometimes we're going to suffer unjustly for our faith. And it may not be fun. However, be encouraged. Because suffering isn't always punishment. But it's our best testimony. You know, sometimes we're going to get frustrated. We're going to get frustrated with ourselves, with our situation, even with our God. And we feel like lashing out. However, you know what? Take hope. Because we can always come to God. And he's a God who will shoulder our burdens and reveal his presence. And that's a promise that we find this week in our passage, where it seems like nothing's going right. And although nothing's going right, we find a God who's still faithful, so that we can still faithfully follow him. Isn't that a great call? Let's pray.